Welcome everybody. My name is Tony UcedaVelez. I'm here to talk about PASTA. PASTA is an acronym for Process for Attack Simulation and Threat Assessment. It's something that me and my co-author from a major international banking institution have come up with after years of kind of looking at what works, what doesn't work in terms of evaluating applications of any type. I'm going to have somewhat of there's a couple metaphors here related to culinary aspects, just to keep it lighthearted, and also there's a couple of, definitely it's a little bit more web-centric. So if you're dealing with more traditional client-server, more like mid-range apps, mainframe apps, this still is really applicable. So let's go ahead and get the party started. Here's quickly the roadmap of what we're going to talk about today. Talk a little bit about me. I've got to establish some credibility with you guys in terms of why am I talking about PASTA today, how could you use PASTA as an application threat modeling methodology. We're going to go into some terminology. There's a lot of terms out there that related to application threat modeling or just threat modeling in general. It's time to level set. It's time to level set on proper and also misuses of terms. We're going to get the recipe for PASTA. PASTA is going to be revealed in a book. It's a trademarked and patented methodology that basically has taken about 2.5 years to research and really kind of apply and get the feedback from a lot of different international security leaders and organizations. We're going to go through these phases of PASTA, and at the end we'll culminate with basically some what the end goal is for this application threat model. So meet the chef, all right. Basically, I don't like to speak about myself. You guys can read up here who I am, what I do. I'm just like you guys, a security practitioner. I don't deem myself a security expert, never will. I don't care how many years of experience I have. But basically, just some key points here. One of the things that really, lends to application threat modeling in general is the diversity of experience. You have to be able to be a jack of all trades. But as many of you know, when you're the jack of all trades, you kind of have shallow waters of expertise across different areas, which is dangerous. So you want to be able to build a good amount of depth across different security disciplines. So that's one of the things. I've been in security ops, network ops, IT, development, been in management, been in monitoring, did the whole 24/7, 365 role at one point in my life. So it all lends to understanding the different security disciplines and how they come together. Now let's talk about some of the terms here. Now this stuff right here up top is from, how many of you here, I'm sure you've heard of like Microsoft's SDLC tool. They have another free tool that they have that we'll actually show some snippets of later on. Microsoft dominates the landscape when it comes to threat modeling. And this terminology right here, asset, threat, vulnerability, attack, these are straight from Microsoft's patterns and practices. What I've added here are some actual terms that are missing. Not that they are excluding it deliberately. I'm sure they're not. I know Mark Curfey. I know the guys working in the ACE team, and those guys are sharp, and they have great products and a really good threat modeling content. But assets, when we're talking about threat modeling, and assets basically, it could be a server, obviously. It could be a software asset. It could be even an information asset, so basically the actual data within an environment. Threat, something bad could happen. Vulnerability, I don't need to explain that. There's a weakness involved in the application and the platform and the network, something can be exploited. Countermeasure, for the auditors in the room, which I don't think there is any, but just in case there is, this could be synonymous to a control. Here are the things that are not reflected in the Microsoft and Patterns website. It's use case. The great thing about threat modeling is that now you take a step back from security and you get back into your IT roots if you came up from there. You get to understand what functional requirements were defined. What is this app supposed to do? Why is it? What is the impersonation account supposed to accomplish between one app server and the cluster of databases? Or you want to understand every single use case within your application environment. Why? So you can defend it better. Because with use cases, you have abuse cases. And of use cases, simply what we security, this functionally oriented security people are out to look for, to destroy, to kind of rehash or circumvent a particular countermeasure or use the business logic for an application. Attack vector, that simply means channel of attack. How am I going to get it? Is it going to be a form field? Is it going to be a human target? Is it going to be, when we say application, when we say threat modeling, I know entities that do threat modeling. There's this, I don't want to say this, that there's this example where there's this a company that does threat modeling, but they're working with the federal government for a Scandinavian country to basically look at the threat model of amendments to their constitution, which is like, whoa, that's kind of crazy. So what is that? What they're trying to derive is what are the threats from the amendments being ratified, the outcry, backlash, etc. What the attack vector in application context simply means this is the channel of attack. Is it a human that's governing access control or access to a particular area? Attack surface is a broader area of attack. It's going to have multiple attack vectors. Attack surface might be your mobile platform. It might be actually an app store marketplace where it has multiple opportunities where you can kind of append to maybe different apps that are very popular, not well certified or not well authenticated in terms of an actual app. You're relying on the fact that people are buying things and you want to get into that thing so you can be a part of their mobile application environment. An actor is simply a caller. If you've done programming, then basically it's who's calling what actions. And it doesn't have to be necessarily in a programmatic sense. It could also be going back to the social engineering aspect. Who's acting as the attacker in a social engineering red team type experiment. Impact, I'm sure you guys know why are we doing any of what we do? If you're a pen tester, if you're a source code analyzer, why are we doing it? I mean, yes, we have our decrees from above that say we have to, do this. Compliance is obviously, unfortunately, a driver. But why are we really doing it? And deriving a business impact is what, in my experience, I humbly would recommend that you derive what the impact is so you can make a better manifestation of risk. We'll get into the whole risk religion warfare debate and the state of it in a second. Attack tree is simply, we know what sort of, basically if you've ever done like any sort of like, you understand the concept of trees and you have like a parent node and then from that you might have branches which might beget, branches which might actually have leaves. Basically you have an asset where you would have, attacks that are tied, or actually you would have use cases that would be married to, attacks, possible attacks, and you might have vulns, the attacks are attacking the vulns, and you might have those vulnerabilities relate to exploitation of misuse cases. But the idea is that the attack tree is an exercise that is not a deliverable, but it's an exercise that you go through in order to say, let me walk through this, let me try to understand how I'm going to attack my application. Now this is a pasta, is food related, metaphor. So what do we have today for dining options for assessing web applications, just to be topical? So we have today's state of mind. We have control gap analysis. Let me do my FSMA, let me do my ISO, let me do my PCI, my HIPAA, my high-tech. And let me just do that gap analysis. And we're caught up doing that, and not to say that is bad. I'm not saying that's bad, but we're just caught up with that pragmatic approach, and we're getting a false sense of like, this is good stuff. We're doing good stuff. And at the end, it's not really healthy for the security organization or the organization overall. And then you have what I call the exploitation wine bars. So you've ever been to a wine bar, you get good quality food, right? You got the cranberry pecan, chicken salad with the blue cheese on top, good stuff. But it's expensive. You got the glass of Chianti. It's expensive. It might take a little bit more time to get served. It's more of an experience, but it's definitely you got some good details when you're actually going through the pen testing. So what am I saying here? Am I saying that dynamic analysis and pen testing is basically old school and threat modeling is a new wave? I'm not saying that. What I am saying is that, well, first off, before I get into pasta, let me just talk and say that, there's multiple different ways to threat model an application. There's an asset-centric way, there's a software-centric way, there's a security-centric way. But like I said before, PROSTA stands for Process of Attack Simulation and Threat Analysis. We want to simulate the attacker in every which way, shape, and form, but we have to understand our apps better. That's where we, as the white hats or the gray hats, are going to have the one-up advantage to the black hats who are on the outside, because we can now understand the topology of our network, the inherent controls across infrastructure devices, application-level controls and countermeasures. This is a risk-based approach. I'll get into why that is, because then at the end, we culminate and say, what are we trying to protect? We're trying to protect the asset's value. And so that's why it's a risk-based approach. This is sexy. This really establishes credibility. If you guys want to kind of, as a security practitioner, you have to be social engineering artists within your own organizations. You're talking to people who are suits, who have business mindsets, and you have to convey things that are of value to them. Why should you eat all this? I mean, if you don't believe in a risk-centric approach or an asset-centric approach, and you're more about software efficiency, which is a software-centric approach, or you're more about just truest security, attack mitigation, that's fine. But think of right now, the current testing solutions that are out there for testing applications really don't tell the full business story. If you're in an application testing group, there's a lot of Chinese walls to your efforts to the rest of the business. So how do you convey, the tester says basically here, I got to X because via ABC. The infosec manager says, well, secure ABC. And he's like, just fix, how you got there. If this is how you got there, I want you to secure it. But the attacker says, I'd rather get into DEF. And so it's not a very holistic approach in terms of, I'm not saying that pen testing or static analysis is bad. Threat modeling actually is the wrapper for a lot of different security disciplines that are out there. So the question stands, do you know your threats? So imagine, for example, running along with the food analogy, imagine if you could have an all-you-can-eat of good quality food. And that's basically what the PASTA methodology, or really threat modeling, tries to convey. Let me basically, not only just understand that, I have cross-site scripting issues on my web application, or I have basically, poor parameterization in my app to database, on my web app. But it also allows you to go beyond that. Understand motive. Understand the actual assets that are going to be, affected. Understand what the callers or actors are. And so it allows you to basically get a more intelligent view and landscape of your application from a security sense. This is PASTA. I'm not going to bore you and spend a lot of time on this. I would ask that you just read this, but I'm going to cover this right side of the this diagram here. When I say define objectives, automatically, as techno geeks that I'm sure most of you guys are, you're looking to basically say, hey, you know what? I don't really care about business objectives. Well, the ironic thing is that if you've been a developer and you've done, any sort of SDLC methodology, you have to get functional requirements that stem from business objectives. Why as security practitioners don't we do the same thing? A pen tester doesn't basically say, let me understand the business objectives of what I'm going to be doing in the next couple of hours. A static source code analyzer doesn't do that either, or social engineering artists. So for that reason, we want to understand what the business objectives are. We want to define the technical scope, and I'm going to dissect this today. This is what this presentation is about. I'm going to dissect all of what goes on to here at a high level so that we can fit this all in. Stage one. Talking about business objectives, let's talk about the evil GRC. Everyone hates on GRC. If you don't know what it is, it's governance, risk, and compliance. It's got three antagonist, polarizing words right there in one acronym, because most of the time it's people that don't understand how to carve up a tool, launch up a tool, just like Andy said this morning, and they're just basically throwing out rule sets based upon best practices or regulatory conditions. So why would I even mention this? Isn't this sort of like application security heresy? Well, not necessarily, because there's a lot of good content. They develop policies for people governing actions, and there's standards that are kind of sparse in those organizations, but that are supposed to govern, have hardening requirements for your Apache server, hardening requirements for your infrastructure devices. So there's a lot of inherent controls that can be built in. So prior to you basically doing a threat model, did you know that you could go through this threat modeling process and say, what do we got? What do we have to work with in terms of a governance? Do we have existing risk assessments that define a risk profile? You're going to hear that term maybe in other circumstances, but a risk profile says, I'm going to build the new mobile app that's going to basically be, so there's a lot of talk about mobile payments. So how is that infrastructure, how is that client application going to look like? And so if we're in the business right now of a startup and doing that, maybe there's some inherent risks that we have to basically address, from the limitations of hardware resources on the actual app and programmatic limitations, etc. So there's a risk profile that we can understand from the beginning. Regulatory landscape, whether we like it or not, there's a lot of companies that are regulated. Utility, government, financial, healthcare, retail. So, we are doing the business a favor. We're getting some credibility as security professionals. If we bake this in, we get those auditors at bay and bake in their requirements by having a baseline of what sort of controls to bake in. If you're looking at PCI, and the requirement for certain processes to be in place, source code analysis or tools like web application firewalls, you bake that into the design. You bake that into your initial development efforts. Okay, so what's out there that you can use? The biggest problem is that all this requires, the G side requires content. The managing people and technology requires someone to write down who's intelligent, not just a tech writer, understands what you're trying to secure, and actually put forth some content. Luckily, okay, so I'm a BSIDEL, I'm a chapter lead, I've been involved with organizations, phenomenal. It's got some cheat sheets, it's got some development guides. So it has some things out of the box that basically say, let me leverage this content, let me build it into my environment, tailor it for what works for me. For example, here's an example of business objectives. So super cookies, very common from a market. If we're marketing people right now, we want to track everybody and their mother. We want to get where they've been, geolocation, everything. So super cookies or persistent cookies are great from a business standpoint. It's a little illegal according to the FTC, but nonetheless, a lot of companies are doing it. A lot of our clients are still doing it. And so as security practitioners, we have to level set and say, okay, you want to do persistent cookies because you want to do tracking and get information so you can do other types of lists for your consumers. This is where we level set, stage 1 business objectives. Easily accessible web services for internal APIs. Web services are escalating, proliferating a lot within the corporate environment. Here's the problem with web services. There's an implicit trust. Oh, I know the development group that wrote it. We trust their efforts. They don't have to do strong typing or signing of the binaries or class objects. It's within our environment. We've got an internal firewall even. How about that? We have to level set with the community, because in security, we always say the given. The given is XYZ might be a credential that's out in the clear. The given is that we have a rogue developer. There's a lot of givens that we can basically role play with. This last component here, over-scoping. If you've ever been part of the definition phase of an SDLC lifecycle, you might get over-ambitious to business reps to say, oh, I want this, I want this, I want this. Oh, you have a roster of functional requirements. And then what happens is that you might have 2 of those functional requirements that beget use cases that are orphaned. Because they're not in scope to the business objectives. So you have orphan use cases. I'm sure you've maybe used different web apps, maybe LinkedIn, social networking things, or financial apps, where it's like they're less maintained use cases of that application. And the danger in that, when they're less maintained, you have old code that doesn't abide by those newer standards or best practices around validation and coding, etc. All right, so here's an artifact. I'm not going to talk about this. This is just simply, well, what type of output is produced here? This is a sample output. This is not something that you share with, like, oh, I'm going to share this with my vendor or my client organization that's asking about a security posture. No, this is like a working document for you when you're assessing an application. merging business and security requirements. So on this side here, you have business requirements, and now you have security requirements. If one of the problems we have in security is that security is at the tail end of everything. We don't have our requirements at the inception of the design process. Now, I'm talking a lot about design and then requirements, so I'm obviously alluding to apps that are in development. How do you do something with a legacy app? How do we basically get the security compliance requirements as part of a legacy app? It's difficult. It's going to have to be post-mortem. But when you have new iterations of legacy apps that are basically being rehashed, redone, then it's an opportune time for all of the things that I just mentioned in this phase to be kicked in. All right, so this culminates stage 1. We're going to go to stage 2. This basically, and hopefully you guys can see all this, but basically, these are the kind of the main steps that happen. One of the things, and I'm a security guy, and I love technology, and I love to kind of work on tools more than anything, but if you want to be a differentiator as a security professional, get to know what the BIA is, which is a legacy type security discipline, business impact analysis. That's something that has been around for years, but if you're able to manifest your web app testing in the business impact context, then you're going to be dangerous. You're going to be highly valued, and you're going to be able to transcend across both the technology and business lines. Let's go to stage 2 real quick. I'm going to do, so stage 2 is technical scope. All this means is basically let's take an inventory. So we're cooking here, we're cooking some pasta. Let's take an inventory of what we got. So we're building, from an architectural standpoint, let's look at our presentation layer, our client devices. Let's look at our internet web server. What type of internet web server are we running? Apache, what version are we running? .NET. Do we have a memcache server? Do we have our F5 load balancers here and a memcache server? So that it's basically caching a lot of requests, statically on a Linux platform. And then going to an Apache, and then going down the LAMP stack to, maybe further down into like a clustered MySQL environment with some Java mixed in here. But we want to understand the nuts and bolts, what platform level, what databases, are we doing DB2? We want to understand the nuts and bolts here across all of the traditional, multi-layered architecture. And this is what you don't get with pen testing or static analysis. And I'm not, again, criticizing that. It's just a different beast, but this is the wrapper. We finally have a chance to back up and say, what do we really have in this environment? Let me understand it better so I can decompose it better. All right, so by defining the technical scope, we basically understand the network topology a lot better. There might be, your network topology might suck. You might have just, allow any, everywhere, every protocol, all the time. Well, now you know. Now you know. There's always a presumption that certain mitigation exists. Remember the comment I said that the attacker is looking to get in DEF. The tester already tested for ABC. The manager's saying secure ABC. So we want to look at everything that was right here so that we can basically understand protocols and services in use case scenarios, externally coming in, and then within the environment. And so you want to model the application and understand security architectural risks. So going back to the SDLC use case, now when we get into the design mode, we can talk to the network, architects and say, what, your design is off. Your design is off because you don't have enough continuity controls, in your network topology. Your application doesn't have enough continuity because it's basically written in C, so it's more susceptible to different types of overflow-based attacks. So we're now able to talk to different people, not just the information owner, application owner with a remediation roster, Excel spreadsheet, and walk away. We're now more intelligent as security professionals. So at the end of this stage, what do we got? We basically have an understanding of the standards that could have been put in place, may have been put in place at stage 1. We understand the business objectives. We limited scope. We understand what's underneath the hood. We understand maybe third-party application dependencies that are in the mix, not excluding them from our testing methodology and scope. So we have more of a kind of substance of application testing. Stage 3. Let's break down the application. Now, let's put away IT. let's put away business ops, and let's get more into the destructive motive mindset, which is what we are naturally born to do. So stage 3, we're going to identify the application controls, and we're going to dissect. Who are the actors in our application. This means application users. So, those credentials that are stored in web.config or in an INI file or, part of a batch script, those in the context of in the PID of the platform that's run as root or run as an elevated system process, that's an actor. When you run the Microsoft tool set that they have from the ACE team, the TAM tool, that they basically help you define actors as a network service, a system service, a user, an application user. So where are the actors at? Now we want to understand what calls do they make. What explicit calls has the software developer, has the security architect, how they envision for how they're going to interrupt, how they're going to basically interoperate between the different layers of the application. This is a key aspect of the faith. No other security discipline breaks down your application. And to the way that now we're kind of like in a constructive way of understanding it. We're going to enumerate all of our use cases, which is going to be helpful if we do an attack tree. We're going to enumerate our use cases so we can map. We're going to have some examples of that as part of this presentation. ID data sources. This is a DFD diagram. This is one of the exercises that you do with application threat modeling. Again, a very traditional, this is kind of outdated really, because you got a user browser, forget about that. You got the plugin stack to worry about. You have a browser stack that has different JavaScript, DHTML, HTML5. Then before that, you got like plugins now that are running on top of that. So you got like Flex and Flash and Silverlight and Ajax. They got their own stack. So there's like something right here. You got to understand calls between that stack, the browser. Obviously, you can't do much here unless you're basically writing the actual, Ajax calls and making like plugins for your clients or your users. But the point is, we want to understand the protocols, the types of calls, posts, GET, any type of request going to your web servers. This is a very simple single point of failure, obviously. These sort of designations too, this is static, kind of the bars, all these things mean something. You can get a lot of this good information on the Microsoft side, but basically you want to identify where your static data at rest is. You want to understand what sort of like APIs, is this basically an XML, is this an XML RPC call? So you're using RPC calls here. Are you using SAMM? Are you using SOAP? What are you using? Are you doing behind your own internal app layer, are you doing SSL? You might not be doing SSL. So you got to be able to understand, is that an issue right here? Is that an issue that I don't do SSL? You want to also look at, when I talk about use cases, this just popped in my head, what about administration? What about the attack vector or the attack surface of the administrator? So somebody's got to maintain all this, the sysadmins, right? What about, them using like Telnet, SSH, RDP, PC Anywhere, whatever they got. We want to understand those use cases as well. So transactional security control analysis as we break down the application. This says these are the transactions that I'm doing. This is another artifact. This is not for the auditors or whatever. This is for your eyes only. You want to understand what risks, based upon maybe the risk profile that we talked about earlier, or you maybe designate some here. Data classification is important. That's going to weigh into that. And then you have all the types of different security things that you should be looking to develop if they're not in place. Session management, properly terminating sessions on web applications, error handling, not divulging too many information about what goes wrong in an application. So this is an artifact, and this is kind of like the stage 3 wrap up here. Stage 4 is going to be the threat analysis. Now, this is where now we cross over, and these next 2 stages are going to be things that we're going to port honestly from the strengths of security operations. Because security operations, we got Dell SecureWorks in here. They do threat intel feeds like Sophos and like other companies do. So threat intel, threat gathering, that's a SOC function. Obviously you got your vuln testing, you got maybe your existing infrastructure is capturing alerts in a SIEM solution. But the point is here is that we're not going to reinvent the wheel as threat modeling, experts. We're going to basically leverage that expertise. We need to enumerate what threats are going to affect our applications environments. And this is basically chalks up to threat intelligence. How do we get there? Prior assessments, other assessments, third-party assessments, threat intel, threat feeds. That's what I'm talking about. That's a lot of data. And there's tools out there to kind of aggregate, correlate, and based upon certain criteria, weigh that sort of data so that you can identify, these different types of PII threats that are based upon these attacks, cross-site scripting, SQL injection, man in the middle. You also have, and any of these types of attacks as well. So the threat is basically saying, what could happen? Are we concerned about data loss? Are we concerned about being a part of the botnet, like the financial institutions are having a huge challenge in responding to? What is the threat for your app, for your organization? This is stuff that you're going to get based upon talking to your monitoring groups. And you get this intelligence through, for example, do you have an IDS, IPS? Do you have firewalls? Who's monitoring them? Are you looking at the intel, the wealth of information that's there? Are you trending attacks? Because if you are, then you might say that you're getting kind of like some weird header requests to your web app, or some, kind of weird, malformed, post requests to your web app, or you might be getting, even like, different types of attacks related to war dialing. Someone's trying to hit. When I do social engineering, I hit the phone system. I want to get the intel on people's machines, and a lot of people don't reset their phone passwords. And if I understand that they have an Avaya or if they have a different type of phone system, I'm going to just do some simple homework and be able to get in 0000, 1234. Down the middle, whatever the case may be. But the point is, what are your threats? Do you understand? Some of the threats are inherent to industry, some of the threats are inherent to the actual platform. For example, here I gave the example of content management systems, Joomla, Zope, Mambo, etc. But going back to the context of the threat modeling for the SDLC, we have an opportune time during the SDLC process to say, we understand our threats because as a threat modeler, we've gone to the SOC. We've basically gotten this intel that over the past year, we've been getting a lot of weird, NetBIOS queries or, DNS queries, to our external, or even within our environment, internal DNS queries or, different probes to file systems that look a little bit weird. So we want to be able to understand that and get that intelligence. Now, all of that has to be automated because there's no way, shape, and form, if you ever worked in a dungeon, in a SOC, there's no way a human can process all of that information. There's also external solutions like VeriSign's incident. You can submit incidents on the various network and get kind of like a trend of what's the hottest incidents that are happening right now for different types of protocols. If you ever use the website Shodan, that basically allows you to see kind of like what are the most popular open discovered services that are out there globally, and they're doing a very good job. That's the type of threat intelligence that, as a threat modeler, you want to be able to understand. Common exploits around access control, around web-based technologies, etc. So, fortunately, content, I could give a separate talk on just content. Security content is a huge problem. Enrique, the SAMM from Symantec, the CEO at RSA, he said, the future is going to be interoperability of data. There's so much data out there. How do we make it all work? So you know about the CVEs, you know about now MITRE has the CWEs for weakness enumeration, OWASP has different lists, SANS has different lists. We want to be able to understand how this library can be managed. Fortunately, this library of different weaknesses and enumeration or attacks with KPEC and MITRE, they're contained more and more with the tool sets that we buy. So we don't have to basically worry about different rosters of like what types of buffer overflow are out there. what are the variants? What heap, buffer, logic bomb expressions do I have to worry about for my web application? Like I said, OWASP has a lot of this content. Depending upon your application, you need to take a look and see what sort of threats am I most likely going to face, and from that, define attacks that you want to test against. It's going to make you a better tester, a better security practitioner. So this is the stage 4 walkthrough. This was threat intel gathering. We're almost there, guys. We just got 3 more. And stage 5 is weakness and vulnerability analysis. This is going to be the easiest step because this is vulnerability detection, weakness and enumeration. We've got all the tools in the world. I don't care if you're Nextboot or Nessus or whatever you use, Saint. But this is where we as threat modelers, we basically extend an olive branch to the SOC, to the security vulnerability detector and say, I need your help. There's nothing, you're talking about just a human aspect of our psyche. There's nothing, better than, just like, the keynote today, when Andy said, you go up to someone and shake their hand. When you go as a security practitioner and say, I need your help, I can't understand the vulnerability of my app unless I get your help. So by including this is an example of there's people already testing the application and the network. So we don't want to basically get in their way and say, I don't know how to do this better. I want to be able to identify vulnerabilities, but we want to leverage that work. We're going to leverage that work. They have their swim lane. We're going to leverage this so that we can integrate it into our attack tree. So it's threat modeling, taking a step back, security is very adversarial to our internal customers. Threat modeling has a way of basically being less adversarial, more collaborative. So this really should have been in the last slide, but this basically is MITRE's CWEs, and you have a roster of different things that they have. The list is everly growing. What I wanted to say about MITRE is that they also have attack vignettes. Attack vignettes are just simply let's make attack scenarios for healthcare. Let's make attack scenarios for retail. So that helps you out because it's well, why are they making these attack vignettes? Because they're talking to all these different players in these industries. They're saying, yeah, we got an incident, where this happened on our healthcare app, within the organization, or this happened within accounts payable within the healthcare department. And so they're seeing a lot of things. They're responding to that by creating these attack scenarios that give everyone the ability to understand what are the common threat scenarios that certain different types of industries face. So I didn't spend a lot of time on 5 because we've all seen it. We've all done it. Vulnerability detection, port mapping, reconnaissance and social engineering, wherever you find the holes, and kind of identifying those holes so that you can map those vulnerabilities to assets, going back to the taxonomy of terms that we had earlier, mapping them to the assets that we've identified during the application decomposition and the technical scope phase, and then marrying the vulnerabilities to the attacks, which is the next phase. We want to now attack the application. We understand it much better than any security discipline that is currently in practice today. If you're doing let's talk about source code analysis. If you're doing source code analysis, you still go through that regimen of I did my manual and I did my automated. My automated found 38,000 vulnerabilities, and my manual found 150, but they're spot on. So the response from that is never what's the business impact? Typically it's fix it. Fix it. It's common with the 38,000. It's one bird kills multiple one stone kills multiple birds. But the point here is that you don't go through this sort of attack planning that you go through with threat modeling, whether it be with PASTA as the methodology or anything else. Well, let's go through this attack tree. So we got a fraudster, and he can basically go through different types of different attack vectors here. We're looking at attack surface. So here's one. The end goal is to basically steal something. So the attack surface here is a site. Here is a different attack surface. It's a little bit smaller. It's the browser, the victim using the site. This is the client entity, the business running the site. And here you have, again, just attacking the user through different social engineering techniques. So you get to kind of think beyond, I know that, for example, a lot of more renowned expert social engineering artists, there's nothing that's off the table. When you want to get to somebody, you do it by any means necessary. Phone, logical network, their personal account, whatever, so that you can connect the dots. But the point is that you want to go through this exercise so you can kind of understand and see what likely attack scenarios are going to be possible. Here is one attack model. So this is, again, a data flow diagram. This is basically looking to exploit cross-site scripting vulnerability on an internal network device. Here is the security administrator. Okay, he's an unsuspecting guy. He's like, I'm not on the target. I'm inside the network. I'm inside this area, so I'm not going to get fed a cross-site scripting link. I've run into so many different internal attackers, or I haven't run into them, but I've identified them, where they're basically colluding and feeding, attacks, whether it be human exploits or something like a malicious link, to an attacker. So here's a scenario where you want to understand, could this possibly happen to you? If basically you're like Unisys, not to call it Unisys, but a lot of these like Booz Allen, a lot of these organizations in the federal government, you're managing a lot of shared infrastructure. Well, if I'm an attacker, you're attracted to me because you're managing a lot of crap. So this scenario right here is very appealing to me as an attacker. It's not going to be appealing as the tester who is basically thinking about NIST 853 or any sort of like benchmark analysis. We whistle through here another artifact. You have different types of attacks. You have different types of This is more from a banking context, but this is an idea in terms of like banking and FIs. They have to basically address it. This is a huge problem for them. So this is another example where you're attack modeling. And ultimately what happens at the end of this is that you're using your pen testing tools, your Metasploit, your Armitage, your Watobo, your WebPD, your whatever you use, SQL Mapper, whatever. You're using this to basically say, okay, I want to do these abuse cases against these use cases, and I'm going to test them with these tools. And you're not doing it as a threat modeler. Now you're extending the invitation to your pen testers and say, this is what I'm worried about. Can you focus on this as part of your repertoire? And they're doing their thing, but they're now getting a different understanding of how different attacks. And then from that, now we're going to get to the final stage, is that we have these mitigations. So these brute force attacks for user authentication. You can have like countermeasures in your applications that are simple, that you do introduce at various levels. But now you start thinking about countermeasure development. It's not just remediation, it's countermeasure development within your infrastructure, within your application. So stage 6 is that. Stage 7 is going to be now this is where it all culminates with pasta. It's about understanding that in security, you're not going to fix everything. You're not. So how do you spend the company's money to fix the right things based upon a true understanding of threats and likely attack vectors? So you are now saying, instead of basically fixing everything because of a control framework, we understand these to be true based upon our intel that we have from our threat intelligence, from our internal monitoring, alerts, and so forth that have been trended. And so we're developing countermeasures that are actually going to be more specific and a better investment for the organization. You've got multiple things here. You've got cross-site scripting, you've got some directory file traversal, you've got SQL injection, you've got the platform level command invocation, and you've got basically elevation of privileges, trying to do basically the orange, which is the bad, and then now we're understanding what countermeasures to develop, not just in our web server, but across the different trust boundaries that we have. We do not trust across these trust boundaries. Maybe we don't even trust within here. So this is the type of knowledge that we get from doing application threat modeling. And typically, it all happens not on a sheet of paper or a report, but it all happens right here with your dev team. So just to end, basically, the risk definition that's always been alive and well is that threats times vulnerabilities times impact. Some people just even lead off the impact. I say that's wrong. Threat times vulnerability times impact times probability. I say that's still not good enough. I prefer, so our risk is residual risk, because that's what you're really trying to basically get to. What is left over? What's the cream at the bottom? So the residual risk is you have impact of something bad going to happen. What is the probability of a threat occurring? What is the probability of a vulnerability being discovered by the attacker? And then you have like divided by countermeasures. You have inherent countermeasures that we define in stage 1. There might be process or technology-based controls. But you're having to factor that in so you don't go to the business and say, invest in my paranoia without me having considered what we actually have underneath the hood. So this is going to be a more intelligent recommendation to the business owners, information owners, etc. When we're, as a threat modeler, when you're in bed with the pen tester, with the source code analyst, now we're substantiating P. P is always like a touchy-feely number. What's the probability? How do I know? I mean, it's, how do I determine if this is going to happen tomorrow or next month? I don't know. Well, that's determined based upon the effectiveness of our testing. If we can test it under a more confined time frame, because we always have somebody with it on our backs to say, hurry up, you got to do the next one, versus the hackers that have all the time in the world and a team to do it, then we have to raise the P coefficient there on this formula. So it elevates basically the value in the analysis. And we're considering, again, inherent countermeasures and countermeasures to be developed. And so the Goldilocks metaphor there, or analogy, is simply that we're finding the perfect blend of countermeasures to develop. It's not just let me get the SAMMs or the Costco bag of countermeasures and let me dump it on the organization, because that's just not effective and it's not working. So tools along the way rapidly. This is Isograph. It's a commercial company. They do threat intelligence, threat modeling for major government science. This is more scientific. It's got some weird mathematical calculations. They're out of California, great company. Obviously, you've got TAM, Microsoft. You've got a lot of the terminologies, components, data. All these are really assets. Use cases. You have your threats. The SDLC version is basically free, but it requires Visio. That's more of a software-centric one. Here's another one. This is the SDLC one. And if you've heard of threat modeling, you've probably heard of Stride, you've probably heard of Dread. Stride is just not a methodology. It's actually a security classification. I'm going to get a spoofing attack, a tampering of data attack, a denial of service attack. Dread is also by Microsoft and says, what is it's an acronym for impact. So they do a good job of doing security-centric and somewhat degree asset-centric. So they what are the reproducibility of this vulnerability? What is the likelihood of exploitation, etc. That's what Dread's about. But this is all about security efficiencies. If you're interested more in that, I'm actually working with an OWASP project. I've come up with a straw man on a software-centric approach with people from SIGITL and other organizations. So look out for a software-centric approach if you're not feeling the risk issue. This is a threat modeling tool called, from a company called MyAppSecurity. And basically, this is as easy as you get with threat modeling. You got very easy to identify caricatures or icons here. You just drag and drop, and they have behind each one of these login events a library of different use cases. So you can basically double click on here, and you're going to get what type of authentication countermeasures maybe you should have, what type of abuse cases are typically seen over these different types of channels. Okay, so benefits really quick, extending the knowledge branch across the board. To business, to IT, to developers, people are now starting to get it and understand what we as security professionals have been talked about. It's basically understanding the things that the other disciplines don't have is we break down our application. We understand business impact. We build in governance. I mean, that's a huge way. Then talk about training. Naturally, as we go through this process and everyone who goes with it, they're naturally being trained. They're just naturally being trained because they're seeing, okay, soup to nuts, this is what I should be worried about. And developers, it's more collaborative versus me going to the developer and saying, here you go, here's your remediation list. I ran a tool, I don't really know what the hell I'm doing, because I'm going to leave. And that's what's happening today, but instead, we're working with developers to say, you know what, our threat modeler, he found that these 5 scenarios are pretty likely to happen based upon threat intel. Let's test these guys, and I found that they're true. The testers have a better knowledge of what they're doing, and the developers have a more understanding of the impact. Follow me on Twitter if you want. I'm at Versprite, or you can send me an email, TonyUV@Versprite, or TonyUV@OWASP. Hopefully this was good, and I really appreciate your time today.